when I said earlier that we're just at the starting point with EBF, it's because we're just at the starting point.
Yeah, okay.
We have to get everyone to agree.
Right,
and the analogy that I can give you is this, because it's so clear. Turns out that the tech sector had exactly the same problem 2 decades ago. Suddenly, there was a profusion of smartphones that wanted to connect to all sorts of things. Now, was Apple going to have to make a deal with every smart refrigerator maker and donut maker? No. Something called Bluetooth emerged, which was a digital handshake. Bluetooth is a nonprofit. Bluetooth does not tell you that you should buy a Samsung phone or an Apple phone. They're impartial. All they're simply saying is, can we agree that there's a handshake, and then go off and make the best phone and go off and make the smartest devices, and you're liberated from trying to figure out how they're going to connect to each other, because we're going to handle that. That's EBF. EBF is a digital handshake for the planet.
Hey, what is good, ReFi Nation? John here. I am so grateful to bring another episode of ReFi Podcast with 2 amazing guests. We've got Douglas Gayeton from the Lexicon and Monty Merlin from ReFi DAO. We dive into what is the EBF, the Ecological Benefit Framework, that over 200 organizations have collaborated to define 6 specific benefits that can come from any project around the world trying to make a difference. It blends the different forms of capital from compliance, grant, and others that are looking to make a positive difference in the world, and creates a simple framework that allows people to agree on a direction where we should all be headed. It also is complementary to ESG. ESG basically boils down into these 6 different components, and it's a really inspiring potential that allows people of various backgrounds to work together towards a vision of a better future. I hope you enjoy the show, and please do leave us a 5-star review if you enjoyed this episode. Thanks so much for tuning in. Let us know what you think. Here we go. Man, thanks so much, both of you guys, for coming all the way out to Lisbon for a conversation. How are you arriving today, Douglas?
I'm ready for action.
Ready for action?
Yeah.
Yes.
I've had a nice cup of Lisbon coffee.
Oh,
so
man.
Ready to go. Charged.
That's it. Yeah.
The Honest Greens experience.
As you do, man. That's the first thing you got to do when coming into Lisbon.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm super excited to dive into this. I feel like you've had such an amazing journey in many different spaces, and I'm curious to unpack really how you got here. But first, for people who haven't been following along, what is EBF and what is it for?
It's another acronym, right? What are we going to do with all of these acronyms?
Yeah, man.
But, the journey to develop the Ecological Benefit Framework, which is what EBF is, was a long one. And it was not even a planned journey, which I guess many of the best journeys are unexpected, right? When you reach a destination that you had never thought you were actually heading toward. I worked in the food space, where that intersection between food and agriculture and sustainability for about 15 years. And started out as a storyteller, doing TV shows that explained what sustainability was and who it looked like, who were the foremost practitioners. And from there, we turned it into artworks that would explain the core concepts and principles, because we are the lexicon, after all, so we're very much language-based.
Yeah.
From there, became exhibits, became books, became all sorts of things. And from there, we began working with the U.S. Department of Agriculture to help them explain organic agriculture. And we created their entire growing organic platform of how do you get people to transition from conventional agriculture to organic.
Sure.
And I thought it was all about transitioning farmers. Turned out it was actually to help the USDA to rethink and reassess how they were explaining it to farmers. So it was really almost to work within the USDA to help them to redefine what it was and what they needed to move toward. From there, we began working with international agencies to help them to understand what biodiversity is. Okay. And we didn't even know what it was called, but I got on an airplane and flew to different places around the world, convinced people to come together to figure out if we could define in very, empiric terms what biodiversity is in terms of food, right? Okay. And turns out it's called a collective action. Didn't know that, Didn't know that everybody had to sign on to it. Didn't understand that either. And it turned out at the end of that journey, we got everyone to align on these are the 25 crops that we need to grow for our futures to get people to turn away from those crops that they were growing just for export, those commodity crops like rice and wheat, to go back to what they originally grew. Yeah. That provided them all those amazing, nutritional benefits that they were casting aside to grow these crops for export and then just buying, this processed food. Sure. And so to get them better, dietary, outcomes. from that journey, Google, which had always been a supporter of our work,
Okay.
Google's like, oh, hang on a second, what's happening here? You're now kind of going beyond storytelling to the actual subjects that you're working with, and you're now mobilizing them. Like, this is a total shift.
Yeah.
And I said, what we need are accelerators for good ideas. How do we bring people that are the foremost practitioners in something that might even view themselves as competitors to each other and get them to align and create solutions to big problems?
Sure.
And so, amazingly, Google has funded that work for the past 5 years on everything from food as medicine to national dietary guidelines to regenerative agriculture to alternative proteins to food packaging.
So
it's
cool.
been amazing, right?
Yeah.
The common denominator in all of those various forays, with, at this point, 1,000 companies and NGOs all working under NDA, was that certifications are important. Who's going to argue? I mean, if I see something that says organic, I'm going to be more inclined to buy it. Who wouldn't, right? If you understand what it means and the values behind that and the impacts of that. But people are more interested now in actually the outcomes. What happened? Why did it happen?
Yeah.
I'm buying something, but what did it lead to? And it was really crazy, but all those things we did, it ended up being the same 6 things. Air, water, soil, biodiversity, equity, and carbon.
Yeah.
So I go to Google and I say, this is kind of crazy. This is, if it was a 1950s robot from a sci-fi film, and you'd say, robot, what did we learn by doing this for 5 years? The robot would spit out air, water, soil, biodiversity, equity, carbon. And so we gathered food companies and we said, okay, this is crazy. We're going to tell you these 6 words. We gave them those 6 words. And we said, does anything that you're doing on the ESG side fall outside of those 6?
Sure.
They couldn't do it. So then it was one of those factoids that you have. You're like, I can tell somebody at a dinner party and they'll think that's pretty cool, but like, what are you going to do with it, right?
Totally.
Because we didn't know what to do with it, right? We just thought, it's true. People they care about these outcomes. They want to know how they're going to change the world, right? They want to know that a purchase contributes to that. But what do you do with it? So then Ripple came to us, the people behind XRP.
Yep.
And Ripple said, hey, we know that you do these things which we call activators. Could you do one for a carbon market? And we said, no. And they're like, why? I'm like, well, because carbon's a fraction.
Sure.
And if you're a system thinker, the last thing you want to do is deal with fractional solutions, because that's how you create unintended consequences.
Absolutely.
I mean, any child who's played whack-a-mole knows, right, that if you solve one problem here, you're maybe creating another problem someplace else. So we said, we have this thing, don't know if it's relevant. It's called ecological benefits, and maybe we could build a framework around that. And so that journey began, bringing together a really amazing collection of people, of which
Super cool.
Monty was one of those core people, to really explore, if you build a framework, can you create a model that shows people how they can specifically impact the things that they care about most?
Yes, absolutely. I remember, Monty, when you first heard of this, you were really on fire. I'm curious what it stirred in you and what the journey's been like getting involved and helping to shape this framework.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's been an incredible journey, being a part of the activator, seeing all of those diverse minds and people come together. I think was definitely one of the things that first struck me when I joined the group was it wasn't just ReFi people, it wasn't just ESG people, payment for ecosystem services, all of these distinct groups which were all like talking their own languages and in their own distinct fields and going deep, but actually bringing those all together to align around something that's very simple, those 6 words, right? But actually you can boil down almost any impact project into that language, which is insanely powerful when we look at like an ESG report that has like 10 pages of waffle around what impact they're having, or like a carbon market that is solely focused on carbon and everything's getting destroyed. And just to be able to take all of those different pieces and plug it in, it really feels like this evolution that has gone on from the kind of green wave, the sustainability wave, to actually instead of just talking about the things and talking about principles and staying at this high level, go all the way down. What's actually happening on the ground to the planet? What are the impacts? And if we can measure that, if we can report the actual impacts, that's how we realign ReFi with actually regenerating the planet. Because you can then channel finance and resources and people towards what's creating the most ecological benefits for the planet in this holistic sense. And that, for me, feels like the solution that we're looking for to coordinate the entire world around saving the planet. And this is the language for me that and the framework that might unlock this if we all rally behind it. And so that's why I'm so excited to have you on this podcast and to go on this, to continue this journey that we've been going on together.
We're just at the beginning.
Just getting started, boys.
It's just started, hasn't it? It's been a little bit under wraps, and now it's all kind of coming out.
Yeah, and I think there's almost this evolution of human consciousness that is now being replicated in the systems that we're using to coordinate value. Like you described, sort of evolution of the green movement and then sustainability, and now talking about actually we need positive outcomes. We have done so much harm that we actually need to restore and replenish and do more. It's not just about neutrality. We need to create a more beautiful and biodiverse world. And I think taking this systems thinking lens with a highly collaborative approach and having all of these different stakeholders with disparate backgrounds buying into a shared language of really what do we value? What do we actually need to survive? Has a lot of promise, because I think frameworks and systems developed by the UN don't really have that voice of the people and the supply chains that they're designed to serve. So I'm curious what the response has been like releasing at Climate Week, who have said what, who's getting excited in this, and where's this all headed?
We made the first public announcement about the Ecological Benefit Framework at Climate Week. It wasn't our desire to do that.
Okay.
I come from the measure twice, cut once school.
Yep.
So, and there's only one opportunity to make a first impression. So I was very leery about publicly disclosing what we're doing because there's so much at stake. And I'm very cognizant that people are very wedded to certain models, either within a company or within an organization. There's even job titles that people would have to defend if you negate a model. But, I think I made the first film about true cost accounting back in 2013 with one of the foremost architects of that, Patrick Holden. From UK Sustainable Food Trust. And so, and then I think I made the second film also on that subject.
You're in it, man.
And so, as it turns out, super fascinating model at the time. In other words, you're not paying the true cost of things, right? There's something called an external cost, which is a negative cost. So, for example, when you buy anything made with corn syrup, whether it's Coca-Cola or corn chips, you're not paying for the government subsidies in that corn. You're not paying for the degradation of water from phosphorus and nitrates that are leaching out of those fields into the Mississippi River or into the Gulf of Mexico, where each year creates a dead zone the size of New Jersey, right? You're not paying for that when you buy that cheap Coke made from corn syrup. And so we all get what negative externalities are, and trying to factor them into the cost of food, by all means laudable. Circular economy is like, okay, let's take that idea of the negative, of the negative externality and apply it to everything, right? Those are all super laudable, but they are a do less bad model. And it turns out nobody gets out of bed in the morning to do less bad, but they're going to probably get out of bed to do more good. And the irony of a do more good model is that it actually addresses the things that are on the negative side of the equation. We have our models wrong. We talk about 9 planetary boundaries. We should be talking about 9 planetary opportunities, right? We need to get into a more positive, we can do this mindset.
100%. I love this.
And we need to be respectful of all those modalities that we've used. But also, if you understand the language of software, true cost accounting and the circular economy, that's middleware. We need to get to the expression layer. We need to get to the public-facing layer.
First
because
principles.
the reality is that consumers don't lean into the circular economy or true cost accounting. But if you can explain to them that an activity leads to a very clear collection of positive impacts, much higher likelihood that they're going to want to address that or lean into it or support it.
Especially if it's simple. I think that's also the power in this model and framework, the fact that there's only 6 dimensions. It's so much easier to digest, whereas the list of different considerations in ESG, some of which contradict one another, like it's hard to grasp. You can't even feel it in your short-term memory.
Yeah. The other thing that you see is like every breakthrough in a certification or a new model that everyone rallies behind, it feels like everyone gets behind it and then it only takes a couple years before everyone discredits it because it's become another vehicle for greenwashing, you know? And so when you just have like a singular stamp that just a verifying body goes, yep, we're going to stamp this with our ESG++ rating or our organic diamond star. Or B Corp's even had troubles with this. ESG. We're not like, I'm not trying to throw shade here, but we all know that ExxonMobil got in the ESG ranking and some questionable companies made B Corp status. And like, those were brilliantly innovative kind of frameworks and ideas in some ways. But I think this provides a real way to actually take the measurements and the data behind each ecological benefit and make that totally transparent and see, okay, there's all these diverse ways you can measure each ecological benefit, and then you can create some form of certainty and fidelity around the confidence you have in the actual impacts it's having, and then compare that to the whole universe of other projects.
We have a lot of challenges in that we talked about true cost accounting, the circular economy, super valuable ways to understand that we're not paying the real price for things and that we need to address those, but maybe not the right model because it's a do less harm model. It should be kind of a do more good model, right? We see the same thing with organic agriculture and regenerative agriculture and climate smart agriculture and nature positive solutions, that these are all almost like competing methodologies for how to till the ground or how to weed or how to water something. And we're spending so much time on these deeply nuanced orthodoxies that we should say, and then what happens as a result of that?
All of this.
And that's why an ecological benefits framework can be useful. We're not saying to you that you should be organic or regenerative organic or whatever these orthodoxies are. We're simply saying that those are all amazing. They're powerful. That shows that you're trying to do good. But let's explain what you're doing in a way that we understand what happens as a result of it.
Sure.
And that's what I think up to now that we've been lacking. Everything has been a very binary, you're either with us or against us model against the backdrop of this do less bad environment that we live in, that I just think we just need to disrupt all of that in the way that an Airbnb, or an Uber, or a Lyft disrupts existing models. We should never be wedded to a model that was never meant to do what we're asking it to do. Like people are trying to bolt biodiversity credits on the side of carbon credits. Not meant to do that. People are trying to use ESG reporting for way more than it was ever meant to do. And that shows that somebody might come in with something that's completely disruptive to that, that's more efficacious, that can ride across all of those existing templates.
I think it'd be super helpful to just unpack a specific use case for this in a project. I'm thinking about, reforestation, for example. There are many carbon projects that finance a, person on the ground, plant a bunch of trees, and to, over a period of time, remove carbon from the atmosphere. And in the current system, the carbon credit really doesn't have a lot of discernment in determining, how long that carbon is stored in the ground and also what all of the other benefits are. How would EBF be applied to this particular instance, and how would it be different from the existing system?
Okay. Could I do biochar instead?
Let's do biochar.
Okay. I want to use biochar because one of the foremost experts in the world on biochar is Josiah Hunt.
Okay.
Pacific Biochar.
Yeah.
I first learned about biochar when I made a film about him for PBS in 2012 or something, 2013. Really amazing guy, right?
Sure.
Then he decides to go from Hawaii, where I made this film. He decides to come to California and start Pacific Biochar and actually start to introduce it into agriculture.
Yeah.
did it at an amazing time because we've had this catastrophic wildfires. They're trying to thin these forests, get all that feedstock, which is all that wood out of the forest. Turns out that the Sierra Club might have been wrong about not touching forests, right? Might have maybe handled that a little bit differently. But that management of that forest, getting that fuel out, what they call it thinning, forest thinning, all that, what are you going to do with all that wood? Well, you could burn it in wood-burning power plants that are clean, and then the byproduct that comes out of that is this biochar. And then you can spread it on agricultural lands, increase water holding capacity, build the vitality of the soil, and all types of amazing equity benefits in terms of air quality and everything else, because that avoided carbon that would happen in fires. And you're sequestering carbon, most efficacious way to do that. So here's Josiah Hunt at dinner with me, and he's explaining to me, people are buying my credits just for the carbon. And they understand that there's all these other co-benefits, but there's no way to monetarily capture that.
Because of the financial instrument of a carbon credit, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I'll tell you what Microsoft did. One of the largest purchasers of biochar credits in 2022 was Microsoft. Why? Because biochar, turns out, is a very efficacious way to sequester carbon in the soil. Okay. But they had to put out a press release that said, okay, we bought this thing for $110 a ton, but we really bought it because there's all these other co-benefits, and we had no other way to explain it to you except in this press release. And he was sitting at dinner explaining it to me. I'm like, there's a lot of value that's not being captured here.
Yes,
and there are people that would care about a water credit. There were people that care about that soil because they know how valuable soil is, right? But there's no way for them even to understand how they could even be involved in a way to support that. And so that was one of the first examples I gave to Ripple when we talked about doing this with them. I said, look at biochar. That was actually our test case. So this is all of the value that is not being captured. And the crazy thing about it is, traditionally you would say, well, carbon is the credit, and then everything else is the co-benefit. But what one person's co-benefit is another person's benefit. They're all benefits, not just carbon. And I think that we were able to show that when we started our relationship with Ripple. That's led to all the work that's come since then.
Love that. I also wanted to give another example that feels like the converse example that also can help to kind of unpack this a little bit. When we look at like a market for carbon, the market mechanism is searching for the cheapest project that can sequester carbon and claim that it's done a ton of carbon. And so what did we see? We see these giant monoculture forests that, okay, maybe there is some carbon being absorbed, although even that is sometimes questionable, but the biodiversity is being completely wrecked. It's actually not even having the reverse of a positive impact on biodiversity. The soil is being degraded again because it's not biodiverse-rich soil. It's disrupting the waterways, and guess who probably owns the projects? Multinational corporations or Westerners, and then there's people who are selling the credits, are skimming money off all the things. The local people on the ground aren't making anything. So actually that carbon credit is actually having just a negative impact just by existing. And so what EBF does is it flips that and goes, you can't look at carbon in this isolated bucket because, of course, carbon is incredibly important. And in a lot of ways, like if we don't solve the carbon problem, we don't solve any of these problems.
Sure.
But you can't solve the carbon problem unless you think about it in this holistic way. Because we need our forests and biodiversity, and we need clean water, and we need clean air, and we need the people on the ground to be the ones that are benefiting from stewarding those projects. So I think it's an essential way, and it's going to potentially upgrade the entire way, not just carbon markets work, but the entire way we think about impact in every context, in terms of the environment and even social and economic systems as well. That's where the kind of equity concept comes in, and I want to unpack that in a sec. But
yeah, for sure. I'm curious, though, how this actually translates to a functioning market. Is this a certificate, an EBF certificate that expresses all of these 6 dimensions over a period of time? Or are there individual assets for each of the 6 dimensions? Like, how is this actually going to play out in terms of a market mechanism that can take somebody like a Microsoft who wants to pay someone else to do a positive impact, and somebody on the ground who can really holistically consider these 6 dimensions?
So let me give you a different way of thinking about why you'd have an ecological benefit framework. We have spent 12,000 years perfecting extraction. Turns out we're super good at it, right? And we've seen all the results of that. We've seen it from biodiversity loss to just desertification across the board. And you can't tell me that climate change is more important than biodiversity loss. Biodiversity loss, each time it happens, is a forever event.
Yeah.
So these are all existential threats,
Yeah.
and they're all connected, right? We can't solve one without having to also try to solve
I hear that.
the others. And the way that we're going to do that is to get everyone to agree that we're going to be moving in the same direction. Because you can't tell impact investing and carbon markets and companies with ESG reporting how to do what they do.
Yeah.
But you can get them to agree that we do have a common destination in mind. And so when I said earlier that we're just at the starting point with EBF, it's because we're just at the starting point.
Yeah, okay.
We have to get everyone to agree.
Right,
and the
right,
analogy that I can give you is this, because it's so clear, right? Turns out that the tech sector had exactly the same problem 2 decades ago. Suddenly, there was a profusion of smartphones that wanted to connect to all sorts of things. Now, was Apple going to have to make a deal with every smart refrigerator maker and door maker? No. Something called Bluetooth emerged, which was a digital handshake. And for those who don't know, Bluetooth is a nonprofit. It's the Bluetooth Special Interest Group, the Bluetooth SIG, right? Bluetooth does not tell you that you should buy a Samsung phone or an Apple phone.
Yeah.
They're impartial. All they're simply saying is, can we agree that there's a handshake, and then go off and make the best phone and go off and make the smartest devices, and you're liberated from trying to figure out how they're going to connect to each other, because we're going to handle that.
Yeah.
That's EBF. EBF is a digital handshake for the planet.
So the way I'm reading that is that you create this framework, right, that unlocks this level of understanding, and then the people who are experts in markets go create the markets that work around EBF. Maybe there's multiple different forms of them, multiple different expressions, but EBF is almost like this protocol, this neutral, interoperable layer that can plug into ESG, into carbon markets, into impact economy, into all of these different places, right? But it's not like all of that work has to be done by the EBF protocol itself. It becomes this kind of place where all of that work plugs into in various different ways and different expressions that then unlocks various different new forms that's all orientated around this more holistic model and way of thinking about the world. So there will be experts in markets and ReFi, and that's what this activator's been about, like gathering all of these diverse groups, different case studies, different applications of it, working then through all of the nitty-gritty complexities that you have to do to then make it interoperable with this really simple framework. So then you kind of like drill down into all of the different, you can imagine it a giant kind of spider diagram of all of the different sectors, the people, and that's kind of way I'm looking at it.
Yeah, when we started, our remit, our job was to apply this to a carbon market.
Right.
And it's not even remotely close to that anymore. I'll give you an example. When the World Food Program was introduced to EBF, they immediately looked at it and they said, oh my God, this is going to allow us to explain what we're doing in sub-Saharan Africa. We're doing the world's largest land restoration projects, but we don't know how we explain the positive impacts that result from that.
Sure.
And they suddenly said, oh, this is going to allow us to do that. So we're actually doing that in Mali right now.
Amazing.
Okay. Yeah.
I love this.
And so
cool.
Then when we started with them, they said, well, nutrition and dietary outcomes, that is the World Food Program, right, is really, really important. How are you going to build that out? And I said, we don't have that. And they said, okay, well, how do you gather the information that you have right now? Because we've done 24 case studies around the world already, right? And I said, well, we have what's called a question set. So, for example, as Vera learned, unfortunately, you might want to have a question set around land tenure, for example, because it might be important to establish land tenure and occupancy and how you would deliver money to the people on the ground. That might be an important consideration. So we spent 9 months devising the question set for EBF just around land tenure, okay? So when the World Food Program saw that, they're like, okay, we're going to build with you that question set that explains the nutritional value of this project. So now stop for a second and think about that. We have a question set that has 10 modules, Now we have an 11th one that's called nutrition. We now have a 12th one which is called land restoration, which we're doing with them. But if this continues in this way, the EBF commons that will emerge from all the work we're doing will probably have hundreds of modules. Which means you'll be able to take a project or a product at a food company, for example, and go to EBF, search out the modules that relate to what you're doing, answer the questions in that question set, and then it'll dynamically generate what you look like in EBF.
Okay, the score.
And that's the value of building this library of all of these things. It's going to build, it's going to get smarter, and obviously play a valuable role in that. It'll get smarter over time. But so when you ask me about how would it be in a market, think about this. A foundation or a venture capitalist or an investor will say, hey, this sounds like an amazing project or product or startup or stock. I want to take a look at its EBF. Because that's written in a language that I understand. It's so simple. I'm going to be able to get a top-line view of something, right? And so,
that's interesting.
Or if you're a foundation, and be like, listen, I love this project. Go to EBF Commons and give us the URL of your EBF, right? And EBF will just be a term that is the dashboard of the positive impacts you're creating to address the things that we care most about in the world.
Totally.
It's a proof of regeneration.
And I guess it's just so early, and we'll see how the financial instruments come to finance those different mechanisms, because you have all these different data flows that are informing effectively the EBF. And like you said, there's all these different modules, and there's different time stamps that these data are coming in. And also you need liquidity and effective volumes to price those different aspects and value clean air over clean water, say. And so this is where I'm kind of starting to try and better understand how these different pieces can be effectively valued from a financial perspective. Like, I understand the kind of language and the framework of breaking down all these positive benefits in that way. I guess I'm just looking forward towards saying, like, where does money and capital make sense?
Well, let me give you two examples to address that really quickly. I told you earlier we didn't want to go to Climate Week and talk about what we were doing. Really, but we're not eager to do that.
Somebody else was excited to tell him.
Why did we decide? There is an impact investing firm in San Francisco called New Day.
Okay, cool.
Led by Doug Gayeton. 25 years as a leader in the space. Works with all those Bay Area family offices. So pretty interesting relationships he has and the capital he brings to bear. And when he began to understand what was happening with EBF, he really put me through a grinder. And I had to do a dozen Zoom calls with international ESG experts that I thought were there to take me down, right? It never happened. But what did happen was he stopped everything he was doing. And at Climate Week, he announced that New Day is built an entire investment platform built on the Ecological Benefit Framework.
Fascinating.
And family offices are already starting to support that. So it was a tremendous validation of what we were doing. I wish we didn't talk about that publicly, wait a while. But it was an amazing, we're working with international banks. Some banks, for example, in some parts of the world are, have multi-billion-dollar funds that they put for like coastal restoration or other things. They don't know how to explain the positive impacts that come out of those things, right? And so we have people that want to create, EBF bonds, right? That is a natural consequence. These are people that create bonds, for a living. Why? Because they know that this is something that sovereigns can wrap their brain around because it's very specific. And if you build funds around these 6 elements, the first thing you can do is create a derivative market where you split them apart. People can just create water. Now, the reason why I keep on saying to you, we're just at that first phase. We're just trying to create the handshake. But so many people have gone way beyond and are already trying to map things out. And I want you to understand that Bluetooth doesn't tell people how to make a phone. all they're doing is managing the handshake. People are going to come up with all kinds of certifications and verifications for measurement using EBF, and our response would be, that's awesome. That's fantastic. Go off and do that. That's how the free market works.
Sure.
People make a better mousetrap, and you just got to support them. We're just trying to say, for us, it's enough to say we need to all point in the same direction.
Yeah.
We're just going to focus
So
on that.
powerful.
And impact investors can do things. Banks that create bonds can do things. People that have NGOs and foundations and want to change the way the nonprofit sector evaluates the impact of individual projects so that they can explain in terms of the things we care about most.
Yeah.
We're trying to help them all at the same time take this framework and apply it into their own ecosystems. One of the first challenges that we had was people saying, well, how do you finance this thing? I mean, you asked it earlier, right?
Yeah,
You said, how does this get financed? And we're like, well, there's not just one way, right? Originally, we started by thinking, this ecological benefit framework is only for carbon markets. Well, it's not.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah, of course.
And so what we had to do was we decided that we had to build a system that could explain to people how money is going to be deployed. So we built a tool that is an interactive, what we call a simulator, that allows you to look at all of the different results of 12,000 years of extraction, and then the pretty poor set of things that we've used to respond to that.
The best we've can so far. And what's gotten us here.
And we have to create a model that says we can't tell people what to do, but we can try to get them all to at least go in the same direction, right? And so how would you do that? Well, the way that we propose is with these 6 ecological benefits. And so the tool explains what each of these benefits are. And then you can actually see who are the buyers in a marketplace that you'd want to address with a framework, because they're all different.
Sure.
So you have the compliance, voluntary, you have grants. So you have, the sovereigns on the left, all the way down to the family offices on the right, the philanthropic. And you could choose any of them, and it will explain. Cool. So if I was to click on the corporate buyer, we know that she's got compliance carbon credits. That she's now leaning into biodiversity credits. So if I was to choose this person from a large company, it actually shows you the value chain. It shows you the purchasing profile of the company. And along the way, it's introducing you to hundreds and hundreds of terms, a taxonomy. Because don't forget, we are the lexicon, right? And so every one of those terms, it explains, right? So it explains hundreds of terms in this. It's extremely deep, so it explains the purchasing profile. And I'll go very quickly through it. It then explains the marketplace, the credit type, and the purchasing strategy, and then the market would be on.
Wow, this is fantastic.
So you can see the credit type, and you can see it's a carbon credit, it's retirable. It explains what retirable means. So we think that people are much more likely to engage in a marketplace if they understand what the marketplace is.
100%.
So this is how do you increase people's literacy. We did 24 case studies around the world. So as an example, there's a cook stove project.
Rohingya, that's interesting.
And then there's Reseed, which is in Brazil. It's a regenerative project. And so you can choose one. Let's just say that we choose the cook stove project in Bangladesh. It tells you why they needed to create a credit, because they need to get the additional revenues from benefits that go beyond carbon, which they're not getting now. And it explains to you what a value chain, again, every step along the way it explains. It even explains to you what MRV is. And it goes down and explains to you how
I love this.
MRV
Wow, this is
works.
so cool.
Literally.
It explains,
You guys are amazing.
You can see why I've been shouting about it for a while to you. I'm like,
it explains verification, what digitization is, and so on and so forth. And then it then explains to you the actual project, and explains, I won't go into the project, explains the benefits generated by that project, like the knowledge sharing, that happens. It explains the beneficiaries that maybe some carbon markets would have probably benefited from spending more time on this part, right? It's like who benefits, and how do we make sure that there's a flow of capital to those beneficiaries on the ground? And then what's beautiful about the model is you see exactly how capital is deployed.
Wow.
And you see how financial resources can create positive impacts.
So cool.
And direct money in the right place. And it does this. I showed you one journey.
One profile. Yeah.
It shows you 6 of them. So this is an example of the type of tools that we create, and to show you this matchmaking that starts to happen, where it's not just, scooping up as many carbon credits completely devoid of any type of relational data.
Yeah.
These are relationships that you're creating.
At the end of the day.
And you're creating relationships that show how the big multinational contributed to a project halfway around the world in Pakistan. That was a cook stove project. And so that for us is the power of so much of what we do at the Lexicon, is identifying how to take the complexity of something, make it easy to understand, get all your stakeholders to agree to it, reach consensus on it, and then build that shared language between all of those things so that you can raise people's fluency and literacy. Because you really can't have a marketplace if people don't understand why or how they're supporting something.
Yeah, that's definitely the insight I was getting in terms of like how do you align and move the capital? You don't necessarily need to create the new mechanisms, although they will come. But if you apply EBF to all that's out there, and then it's very clear whichever section of impact finance you work on, whether it's carbon markets or impact bonds, you can suddenly see, okay, this impact bond is having the most ESG, and then capital goes towards that one. And so you're upgrading almost every other markets around and different sources of capital to then reorientate that capital towards generating ecological benefits. So, we've always said, like, the capital is there, it's ready to be deployed. It just needs the trust and the kind of verifiability of the impact that it's going to create. And suddenly we can create rapid change and deploy that capital in ways that's going to create this impact.
Yeah, and also markets that are efficient, that enable that exchange of value. And I think it was interesting how sort of ReFi DAO got involved. I know Sev Nightingale kind of started this What is ReFi working group that you participated with. And it was fascinating to see that working group really sort of jump into EBF. And I'm curious what this sort of connection in your mind is between ReFi and EBF, and why was there such a strong draw to the work that Douglas and his collaborators were doing at the Lexicon?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to touch on that. So ReFi, regenerative finance, is built on the idea of creating regenerative financial systems and experimenting with these new technologies, AI, blockchain, Web3, measurement, reporting, verification, all of these things. But when we look about what regeneration actually is, it's like a system dynamic of building resource capacity. And when we talk about ReFi in the Web3 space, there's a lot of really interesting work going in creating these regenerative crypto economic systems. And that's a big upgrade from where the current Web3 space is and the history of it in terms of the pump and dump, degen, ICO, NFT kind of stuff. And so to create regenerative crypto economic systems, that would be great. At least they wouldn't just be, everyone losing their money and all of this kind of stuff. So there's some really exciting work going on in that direction. The public goods space, Green Pill, Gitcoin, all of that amazing, awesome ecosystem. But I think one of the original critiques of the ReFi space was, what if you go off and you do all of this token stuff and that economy keeps on growing, but where's the link to the real world? What's actually changing in the real world, or are you just growing numbers on a computer screen, And so for me, I see EBF as the tool to be able to plug into ReFi and go, this is how much positive impact is actually being generated on the ground, and aligning the kind of amazing innovation that's going on in the ReFi space with how it's impacting the environment and the people and the nature on the ground on Earth. And so that's, for me, what I'm really excited about, to align ReFi with EBF and what does it look like to plug this EBF framework into the entire ReFi ecosystem. Hopefully that's going to be the journey that we go on from here.
And I think it also helps answer the question of what is regeneration. Right, at the end of the day, we're all sort of exploring this new territory, and to have a simple framework that describes, the different dimensions of positive benefits is really an enabler for coordination. And so I think there's a really strong case for this. And I'm curious, Douglas, what your take is on the role of blockchain in the implementation of EBF in, markets all around the world.
So first of all, I just want to quickly touch on what Monty said. So from the very beginning of the activator, I focused as much free energy as I had available on Monty.
He picked on me, but
on cajoling him, on constantly nudging him, constantly being a presence, never letting him get too far away. Because when I first understood what ReFi was, I said, ReFi is these ecological benefits.
Yeah.
This is literally, it could be foundational principles for this group.
Totally.
And so any content maker always has to know their audience, right?
Mm-hmm.
Any writer knows who they're writing for, right?
Yeah.
So I always had Monty front of mind.
Monty is quintessential ReFi.
Yeah. And so for the past 6 months, Monty, you've been very front of mind for me.
Me too, bro.
Well, I'm just trying to think about, and I would always be like, well, Monty didn't really positively get off on that part of it, or he didn't really respond to this part of it. That's interesting. Why not, right?
Yeah.
So for me, it was a really important litmus test as our group, because I'm certainly not the only person leading EBF. There's an entire group of people, right?
Sure.
But I would always say, I just keep on thinking that ReFi is going to be the early adopters. But it's so amazing that what Monty said, which is that we get caught in our own loops. We get caught in our own bubbles, right? It's just natural. And so I am on the ground. I work with those organizations that are on the ground, those visionary companies that are on the ground creating new things. But they don't know how to explain what they're doing in a way that a financial market would even understand it.
Yeah.
So when I say to you repeatedly that we're at the first step, the first step is, how do we boost people's fluency, their literacy about going out of a do less bad model to do a more good model? I credit my partner at the Lexicon for really establishing that mindset.
Yeah.
When we first began the Lexicon, we were approached to do a project about the ills of industrial meat, right? And they made a very persuasive case to have me do a book for them. And as soon as they left, my partner looked at me and she said, "No way."
Yeah.
And she said something I never forgot. She said, "We don't do crisis pornography."
Yeah.
She said, everything we do is going to be a solution, because a solution explains the problem in it.
Yeah.
And it's infinitely harder to find the solution. There's going to be no shortage of people that will point out the world's problems. We're going to stay away from them. We're only going to focus on the people who get shit done. And so imagine if you could take all of this energy that's in the ReFi movement and connect it to the people on the ground that are doing things, and then help them with a common language.
Yes.
That's just 6 words.
Yeah, and I totally get that. And I think there is this common language that can enable people to work together in the same direction. But I'm curious, again, just tapping into the role of blockchain in all of this, because there's so many different tech solutions around there. And yet you seem to gravitate towards this one in particular around the sort of first use case of implementing this framework.
Well, first of all, big shout out to BXC, Blockchain for Climate, and GBBC, the Global Blockchain Business Council, because Dave Ford and Sandra actually were funders of a lot of this work, and really supportive from the very beginning, which was really, I thought, really a tremendous vote of support for something. Blockchain is a pipe, right? And so it's, what value does that pipe provide? And but it can also be have and have not problem for people, especially in the global South, who might not be able to put something on chain.
Sure.
And so, just as we learned in the very beginning of our work in regenerative agriculture, you have to find a way to bring together qualitative and quantitative measurement. Each of them have value. We have to figure out a way to balance the efficacy of blockchain with indigenous knowledge, which is also qualitative, which might not lend itself. And so I'm really curious to see in the evolving of blockchain how it helps people who are not digital. And we don't want to create a have and have not. We don't want to create some kind of exclusionary technology. But I'm intimate with blockchain. One of the very first blockchains in the food space was ReFi, and I was there from the very beginning. We tried to put farms and food systems for restaurant chains on blockchain. Super hard to do. because you've got to put sensors everywhere. There's a cost of putting those sensors in the ground to maintaining them.
Yeah, and then storing the data.
Yeah, and then so there's a cost of establishing that. And then furthermore, all kinds of unlikely things emerged. When you put a whole bunch of farmers on chain because they're providing to the same restaurant chain, they could see what each other's doing. They could see when somebody's watering, when somebody's adding nutrients, and they could basically get somebody's model and deconstruct it. And so often we had situations where people were spending the money to put the sensors in and then realized that they wanted to recoup that cost by privatizing their data and getting paid for it, while others didn't want anybody else on the chain to see what they're doing because it revealed proprietary trade secrets. So there's all kinds of unintended consequences that we need to really unpack with blockchain, and we need to really get at we need to really get at how do we, from an equity standpoint, integrate the value of indigenous knowledge that's mostly off chain. So that's for me the ongoing dialogue.
Yeah.
And I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
No, I think it's really interesting, and it sounds like you got into the blockchain space quite early and was like, damn, there's some real problems here. Like, the technology is expensive and it's got these challenges. And I think it's been really interesting to see how the technology has evolving and is still continually evolving, and the kind of pace of innovation. Multiple of the problems you've mentioned, there's like a lot of work going on addressing those problems. When we talk about, obviously, the gas prices, that's pretty much being solved by proof of stake and the Ethereum superchain and all of these kind of really efficient blockchains, the data storage stuff, and the kind of transparency of having, how do you have radical transparency but also have the ability to have certain bits of data that isn't just open for the entire network, so we get into like zero knowledge proofs and all of this kind of innovation that's upgrading this tech stack so that it can be this global substrate, right? That we can plug in the EBF and suddenly there's giant transparency as to the data sources that are coming in, the transactions that are happening on top of that. And I know you're good close with Gregory and the work he's doing with Regen Network, for example.
Sure.
And
I don't want to give the impression that we're anti-blockchain, because obviously we're super intimate with it, right?
Absolutely.
But I'm very sober. Don't forget I'm a measured twice, cut once kind of a guy. So, but I would say this: is it inevitable? Yeah. Are we there yet? No.
Yeah.
And we need to take this time now to figure out the imbalance of access, because this is across the board. One of the key things about the Ecological Benefit Framework is that how do we take the custodians, the caretakers of the world's biodiversity, and reward them for that stewardship? We're not. The models are all stacked against them.
Yeah.
One of the most fascinating things that everyone was so confounded about when we started EBF was we said we're going to build these question sets for these 24 case studies, and we're going to allow everyone that we're doing a case study of to rewrite the questions.
Wow, so cool.
Because how are we to assume
that you knew the questions to ask?
Yeah. And then everybody's like, that's a lot of work. I'm like, yeah, it's 24 times the work. But the result of that is you'll now understand how to build an adaptive framework where you can say, different places you have to ask that question in a different context to be respectful. Otherwise, we're just creating another top-down system, and we've seen the results of those. They reward the people at the top.
Yeah, absolutely. And we also need to learn how to propagate that cultural knowledge the indigenous communities have stewarded for millennia that actually allow us to live in harmony long term with these natural systems. And sometimes it's really hard to quantify and measure that. And I think there's an interesting case here, like you said, the balancing the quantitative and the qualitative. And yet at the same time, there is this pivotal challenge around usability where right now, a lot of the tech is hard to use. And I really appreciate you pointing out, this needing to be in service of people in the global south, because at the end of the day, they're the stewards of our existing biodiversity. And we in the developed nations, we've lost most of it already. And so I think it's a very interesting and pivotal moment in history. And I do see your enthusiasm for this framework within the ReFi space. And I'm curious, what your thoughts are, Monty, where this heads and what this can enable communities on the ground who are curious about this tech to really make a difference in the world and tell a better story to attract more capital at the end of the day.
Yeah. So like I said, I think it's the future of this framework is hopefully it can be bigger than ESG, but far more impactful, and empower the people on the ground, to the stewards, to actually be involved in their project, to help add into the data that verifies these projects, and then unlocks access to these global sources of capital, whether it's grant funding, philanthropy, to carbon markets, to big institutional investors. And if you can create that connection with this bottom-up way and cut out a lot of the middlemen, that was the exciting thing I think about blockchain in carbon markets for me, was like, can we stop like all of the brokers scraping off, to the point where the brokers are making 60% of the value and the people on the ground are left with nothing, and they're employing people from the other side of the world to verify the impact, and the people on the ground again are not benefiting from that. So I think reorientating it from this bottoms-up perspective, and I also think it's where some of our local nodes and can come in as well. And you have these local communities who do understand the technology, and obviously it's becoming more accessible as it goes on, but are then able to form these local communities in places around the world, and then work with the local people. They are from that area, they speak the language, and then that is the model to create these communities of support to develop these ecological benefits projects all over the world.
100%.
And then what if we have a network of these projects connected to these local communities? What kind of capital is that going to then unlock that can then fund these people and the work they're doing on the ground?
Yes, absolutely.
And like that, for me, I think is where all of this is heading. So I'm very excited to have been a part of this process, and let's see what kind of models we can use EBF to build with to enable that vision.
And I think the folks in Tanzania, the local node down there, David from Chatafisha, they're really bringing very critical insights about the problems that people in their community are facing. And they've built a product that really addresses, some of the core problems of people on the ground. And they're telling all of these nodes around the world what they're doing and what's working and what isn't, and to have a framework of value that they can use to define the benefits and the impacts that they're having that work for a Google or a Microsoft or a World Food Program is an incredibly powerful tool, because otherwise people are just constantly speaking a different language. And so I think
Chatafisha is one of our 24 case studies.
Oh, dude, that's awesome. That's amazing. Yeah. Okay, well, maybe this is why it's picked up. But I love the network weaving that's happening here.
Well, so let me, first of all, applaud you for the local node model that you're developing. I'll tell you something that is interesting.
Yeah.
One of our very first activators was on regenerative agriculture. And I really was excited to do it because I wanted to address the wrongs that I had done in the organic space.
Okay.
And so organic certification is basically a top-down model. This is how we're going to solve this thing, and it's like kind of universal. But anybody who's grown a tomato knows that growing a tomato in Georgia is different than growing a tomato in California, okay? So this idea that this one-size-fits-all model doesn't work.
Yeah.
Regenerative agriculture is a collection of universal principles. But their application literally changes from one farm to the next, from fence post to fence post. So this idea that you have a universal framework for regenerative agriculture is kind of inane. If you're a farmer, you would know that it's very place-based. So Regen 1, which we created, which had hundreds of food service companies and supermarket chains like Whole Food and leading agronomists and soil scientists and hundreds of farmers and ranchers, is a place-based model for regenerative agriculture. And what you do is you take what works in one place and then use an adaptive framework.
Yes.
So what you're doing with your model is that's how regenerative agriculture works. You're saying you have a set of universal principles for ReFi, but their application is place-based.
100%, and we have to honor that.
You have to honor that because it's a bottom-up model.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, totally.
And you have to be local wherever you are.
Yeah, and this was really the heart of the kind of organization design as we were looking at, like, how could you make a DAO that could really service this growing movement. You can't do it from a top-down, online-first standpoint. It just doesn't work. You have to honor local sovereignty and what's working on the ground for those people in those places, and really create an example for not only onboarding people in that community to the tech and making sure the tech is usable for them, but also ensuring that the capital is actually going to the people that are doing the difference. And I think, there's always a lot of pressure to sort of decentralize everything and, go towards financializing whatever you do as soon as you can. But I really held a sort of patient, long-term perseverance to saying, actually, we have to have an international, global network that can really root this idea of regeneration in the real world problems, that can anchor this tech to solving, what's happening in the soil, what's happening in our water.
Yeah.
And I think we're really just beginning to see the start of that, with 40 or so nodes. I mean, imagine if we have 100, 150 all over the world that can apply EBF, and with capital flows towards this benefit and really showcase, hey, this is working. And there's very few costs involved in the middle because of this tech layer that enables financing at scale with very low costs.
Well, this is an example of how we could immediately find ways to collaborate. So people have asked me, so at some point EBF, is it going to continue as a project at the Lexicon, or where does it go?
Yeah, sure.
So our work with these activators that we do, they leave. They become nonprofits, Or some of them become like UN programs or whatever, right? So they leave the home, as it were.
Yeah, as they should.
Yeah, and EBF will become EBF Commons, probably within the next year, right?
So
yeah.
cool.
And
Love it,
but that Commons, so the first thing that people say, very skeptical, sounds like there could be money involved here. Does money come into the Commons, and where does it go? Well, one of the main places where it would go is microgrants. Because in the Global South, if you're trying to create a value and trust in evaluation that somebody's making, and this, what I would call it, in the Global South, if people use EBF to explain a project, they're making a values declaration. Now, how do you give that values declaration sense in a marketplace? You have to have some kind of trust on the data that's gathered.
Yeah.
But then you're like, oh, but hang on a second. You don't have the people with domain expertise on the ground to do that measurement. You don't have the tools on the ground to do that measurement. So I don't trust what you're saying because I don't have all those traditional global north ways to value something. But in the Global South, they have all kinds of amazing tools that your nodes could take advantage of. Like, for example, there's the participatory guarantee system.
Interesting, I've never heard of that.
So basically what it says, there's a village of people that are all growing the same crop. Let's say they're all growing mangoes. It's in their best interest that everybody does a damn good job growing those mangoes. Because if one person is a laggard, it's going to bring down the value of all their mangoes. So if they can go with each other and make sure that each of them is following the precepts or what they've agreed to that is sustainable, then they will all be held to account, right? I'll give you an example. Organic certification in the United States. Very few people know this story. 7 farmers in Oregon go to hear a famous old-time farmer talk. And they say to him, your ideas are genius. After his lecture, they go, your ideas are genius. I wish we could tell more people, and I wish we could show that we're following all your ideas. And he said, well, why don't you create a certification? Like, well, how would we do that? They're like, well, you're 7 farmers, figure it out. So they drove home. On 2 pieces of paper, they wrote down, on both sides of the paper, what organic meant to them. Then they went to each other's farms, and they said, oh, you're doing all those things? You got their thing. We need a logo. Okay, we're going to call ourselves Oregon Tilth.
No way. I had no idea.
And so suddenly Oregon Tilth was suddenly the thing that you wanted to get certified. When nobody could distinguish themselves in a marketplace, suddenly it was Oregon Tilth. The USDA certification for organic started with 7 guys with a piece of paper. That's the participatory guarantee system. So in lieu of these these quantitative tools to measure things, we have to start somewhere.
Yep.
The thing about it is there's always going to be somebody who says, we can't do this thing until we have all of the ways to measure things, and it's been worked out and tested for 10 years. That would have been great in 2002.
Right. Our planet is on fire. And
So
biodiversity.
we need to develop iterative models.
Yep.
We need to be working towards solutions in parallel. We need to use any means necessary. And, when people talk about rainforests, like, oh, there's so many indigenous, plants that have have medicinal value. whenever I hear this about there's all these medicines that can be created from the plants, I'm always like, there's so much indigenous knowledge that could be gathered from the people that are in that rainforest that's not being gathered. You know, people talk about food waste. I always talk about information waste, right? There's so much information waste among people with domain expertise that we're not gathering. The participatory guarantee system is just one of those mechanisms that can allow people in the global south to have a much clearer understanding, a greater valuation for the benefits that they're providing for us in lieu of all of these existing standardized quantitative ways to measure things.
Yeah, man. This is it's such an interesting design space, and I think it's really exciting to be a part of a positive looking consensus mechanism around what matters across the world. And I think if you guys are able to continue to steward this as a commons that has all of these different stakeholders, the different colors of capital, like you said, from the carbon markets to grant makers and philanthropists, there's huge potential in this. And I'm curious, as we're kind of running out of time here, Douglas, like what's your secret sauce as a human? It feels like you've got a lot of life force in you, and you've created some beautiful things in the world. But what really makes you tick, and what's in there?
Well, first of all, you can't do anything by yourself. So you have to figure out how you're going to involve others. And I learned something at the very beginning. I've had almost 1,000 NGOs and companies in our activators in the last 5 years.
Wow.
And I've made every possible mistake you can make about how not to mobilize people. But I've also learned a couple of really valuable things. And one of them is you have to lean into people's selfishness. People talk about this is pre-competitive space. What does that even mean? We're all competitive. We never stop being competitive. So therefore, I always try to figure out, what do people want? And how can I create something where they're going to get that? Also, whenever somebody thinks that they're gaming one of our activators by selfishly getting the group to do something because they need it for their own company, what they don't know is I've been waiting for them to do that, because I consider them to be the person who's farther ahead of the group that's already got to the cave, and they're yelling back, we need a flashlight. And everybody's like, we're in the sunlight. Why is this guy yelling for a flashlight? He has no idea. But he's farther ahead on that one part. And so I'm always looking for those selfish people. Alexis B. Tocqueville called that enlightened self-interest. And he said it's what distinguished the early Americans, is that we had this idea of wanting something for ourselves, but understanding it would be for everyone's benefit at the same time. So there's an architecture of how we build all these activators we do by getting people across the value chain. But, we'll have hundreds of interviews before we choose who we invite in. Because I want a mix of really smart people, really selfish people. And then also, I used to have this idea that I remember once telling somebody at Google, it's going to be the chopping block tomorrow. I'm going to get rid of these 20 people in the activator. They never contribute, and I'm going to show everybody that we're serious. And they're like, Douglas, hang on a second. Why are you kicking them out? Because they don't contribute. Because they're just there, they're dead wood. And they said, no, Douglas, no. Some people are going to contribute.
Yeah.
Some people are an incredibly valuable conduit into their corporate or
100%.
ecosystem, and they're just there to soak everything up, and then they're going to go and they're going to evangelize within their own ecosystems. So I've learned the hard way, having done this dozens and dozens of times, of what coalition building looks like, which is why I've taken great pains today to tell you I am not EBF.
Totally.
It's really important to create an environment where it's co-created.
Yeah, 100%.
And just like when I told you, EBF is just that Bluetooth handshake. We're not here to say, this is the best phone, this is the best smart refrigerator. We're simply to say, this is the handshake that connects them all. And then in the marketplace, there's our consumer reports or whatever other vehicles that people use to make those valuations, which we would totally support. We would do everything possible to help them. We think there's going to be supply chain tools that use EBF, because companies are not going to be able to get rid of ESG reporting anytime soon, but they could start by rethinking how their supply chain purchasing tools work and use EBS as a framework. So that we are very, very strategic on how we try to build out places where we can provide as much information as possible so that they can go and start their own ecosystems using the framework.
So powerful. We've covered a lot of ground today, Monty. Is there anything that we haven't excavated that you want to before we wrap up?
just that I'm incredibly excited to be on this journey, and very much looking forward to seeing how EBF grows and evolves from this spot, and how we can utilize it in the refi space and beyond that, and build all these bridges. I feel like it's a really brilliant path to align the kind of other conventional spaces in the all of these global movements, and channel them towards.
And who knows? I think if we were to get together and have a conversation a year from now, I think we'd be amazed at how different this looks. As new people come in with new ideas, with new utilizations of what we're doing. I'm always amazed with each new conversation, each new opportunity that comes before us, almost every day at this point now. It's really, when you start one of these things, it's always you're pushing all this energy this way. And then when that tidal shift happens, it all starts coming in. So now we're in everything's coming in our direction now. We're trying to field who are the best strategic partners to have. But our next sprint is going to focus on, we don't call them working groups, we call them work streams, because streams feed into a river. And so we're going to do one on each of these 6 ecological benefits, and then one that's just on the governance structure. As we work to figure out how you build the commons, how that governance work, how do we adjudicate it, and how do we build the models that are going to give it, ongoing sustainability.
Damn,
and there's a lot of work, a lot of lessons to be drawn from the DAO space and the decentralized organization space, because there's been a lot of hard lessons learned, I think, by a lot of organizations, and so it'd be interesting to see how it plays into that and how it emerges. So
and there's a lot of organizational design outside of the Web3 space, I think, and I think it'll be exciting to see who comes around in that vein. I'm curious for people listening who are excited, how can they get involved?
Well, we have a website. I usually, when I'm asked to talk about our work, I always end with the same question, which is, can you change the future? Because if you're not thinking about that, then you might be engaged in the wrong occupation. And so, if what you're doing is not leading positively to impact the change that you want to see in the world. Because the reality is, I think that Gen Z, for example, has learned that it turns out nobody's coming, right? They were waiting at the bus stop and the bus didn't come. So they're realizing now that they're probably going to have to take these things on themselves, with the purchases that they make, with the actions that they make, and with the way that they deploy their capital, right? The companies that they build and the values that guide them. And so that question that you need to ask yourself, and when you put your head on the pillow every night, is that, what am I doing to change the future? So the URL actually is not Ecological Benefit Framework whatever, It's, can you change the future? That is the URL. And I would imagine for most people, that will be not only the question that they ask, but hopefully the destination where they go. And so if they were to go today to canyouchangethefuture.org, they'll be able to learn more about what we've done. The toe that we were forced to put in the water by this event on Climate Week that led us, and we would have certainly been way under the radar for another year.
Hey, man.
But it's okay. We're out. We're out now, and so we're starting to talk about it. They can go to the website, dive a little bit deeper into what we're doing. There's a place for them to learn more and to join. It's all hands on deck. We need as many people as possible. We dedicate 0.0001% of our time to social media.
Just let everyone else do it.
And so we're hoping that as we move forward, that we'll get some support on that side from people who can carry the banner. It's a distributed solution.
Yeah, man.
As in all these things. And I think that's why, from the very beginning, I've always thought of the refi space as central to what we want to do next.
It's an honor. Thanks so much for coming all the way out, Douglas.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, for it.
Thanks so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the show. I would be so incredibly grateful if you could leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to your podcast. This helps us reach more listeners, attract amazing guests, and ultimately get the story of regeneration out to a wider audience. It takes just a couple seconds and makes a massive difference. Thanks so much, and do let us know if there's any guests that you'd love to hear from. We'd be very grateful to hear from you. Thanks.